All right. So speaking about climate and climate change,
Yes.
I feel like it was all encompassing. It was everywhere. It was all everybody was talking about. And I sometimes forget how influential the leadership of the US is on an issue like this
Yeah.
because with the lack of leadership coming out of Washington, I've noticed it just kind of dim and like lose momentum. Is that true other places? Or is it harder to get funding? Is it harder to get attention? Because I just was listening because I'm a giant nerd, to a deep dive on energy this morning, and they were talking about how China and India are now getting more energy from renewables than from coal, and the US and Europe are actually the only places that are still getting most of their energy from fossil fuels from coal. What does that say to you about where this conversation is going? Has the US and Europe kind of lost momentum, and do you think Asia will pick it up?
Well, climate is not the prettiest girl or guy at the dance anymore, politically, but I think that it's inevitable the march forward of where we need to be. And it's up to the United States leadership right now, for Europe as well, to decide whether not only will that progress continue and be accelerated, but also will the green jobs of the future be in Europe, be in the United States, or will they be solely in China and maybe even in India? It's like giving away tomorrow's oil because today we can't see past our noses. And I would say in the United States, climate work is very much alive. Here in California, my state, for instance, last summer, we had for the first time 100% renewable energy for our grid. Not only was solar the number one source, number two was energy storage. Battery storage was the number two, above, obviously coal, which we don't have anymore in the state, but above natural gas, above nuclear and anything else. So I think it's inevitable to progress. But my message as ambassador representing all the cities of the world and working together with the states and regions of the world to represent that subnational level is nations are primarily kind of failing to meet their own science and their own commitments. The Paris science demands, certain progress, and only one country is on track to meet those benchmarks, Denmark. But when you look at the 100 largest cities, which are part of C40, 97 cities to be exact right now, over three-quarters of them are not only ahead of their nations, over three-quarters of them are on track to meet the science of Paris. So if you're thinking the world is failing, just look to the cities of the world where you'll be inspired. And trust me, cities are as complex as nations. I had to run my own electricity grid. We own the largest municipal utility in Los Angeles when I was mayor. We see people who run transportation networks, do building codes for green buildings or not green buildings. We look at the way that people emit by the zoning of the sorts of factories and the power that powers those factories around the world. And we represent about 24% of the GDP of the world, just those 100 countries, sorry, 100 cities. And if we can get there and be even ahead of schedule, my message is not only is it alive and well in America, it's alive and well globally. Where there is failure is communicating any victories, and we're only halfway there. If we think we're going to coast to victory, that's not going to happen. And by the way, in America, it's not just blue states. The most wind is coming out of Iowa as a percentage. Right now, one of the largest oil basins in the world in Texas is being decarbonized by Republican leaders, primarily through solar power. The question is, do we want those solar cells only to come from one country, China, or will America and other countries invest in diversifying that? You look at electric cars. I've been an EV driver since 1998, that are the future, will be the future. And you can put your head in the sand and say, I'm going to have a gas car for the next 50 years, but that just simply isn't the truth. And you won't have any auto workers in a couple decades. So my message is get with this program. America is absolutely still in. But you're right to say there's a lot of people who are retreating from talking about it, retreating from investing in it. And at the same time, when that happens, there are plenty of other people in the world who will make those investments. And when the future, let's not let them.
But I wonder, you said there's a communications issue with talking about your victories, which I do think that's true because when it just becomes a bummer, like people feel like they're helpless, they can't do anything. So like, why am I'm turning this off. But the other issue to me is I wonder if the environmental community needs to shift their messaging a bit to make it more pragmatic, to make it more of an economic argument. It's not about lofty idealism and altruism and to make it about pragmatism. This is cheaper energy. This will be better for your economy. We are going to get beat. Do you think that should be more of a focus than it is?
I do. I do think it's about the bottom line of people's kitchen tables. It's also about the safety of their homes. We talk about, millions of tons of CO2 and 99.99% of the world tunes out. But we talk about the fires that burned down 12,000 structures and homes in Los Angeles, the deadliest perhaps disaster in American history. We talk about the flooding that happens when you see in a place like Pakistan, thousands of lives that are lost from flooding. When you see the extreme heat that's killing people every summer around the world. When you talk about survival, it becomes much more powerful. And when you talk about the economic survival of the future, like what's my energy bill going to be? And now solar is much cheaper than gas, and certainly cheaper than coal. And when you look at the health costs, living in New Delhi, I loved India. It is the most beautiful country. I took 183 flights, went to 33 of the 36 states and territories. But the worst air in the world is in New Delhi, unfortunately. It's estimated 10 years of someone's life who has to work outdoors is reduced by simply the air pollution. And I don't talk down about that because Los Angeles was the worst air pollution in America when I was growing up. And yet we figured out a way. We looked at Beijing 20 years ago that was killing people. And there's ways of doing this. So I think we have to change the messaging to say this is achievable, it is cheaper, and you will live longer. And if we just get into the science of it or the legal negotiations, because nations are not particularly great at that. And so our message at this COP is let cities and states in, hold us accountable, and we will show you progress. And by the way, you can claim progress because every prime minister, every president lives in a city too, just as every citizen is part of a country.
Can I briefly push back a little bit? Because, we
Yep.
are an important zero carbon country in the UK with a lot of renewables, or with a very ambitious program. But on the other hand, the short term or medium term effect is that we have the highest electricity prices, certainly in Europe, and I think amongst the highest in the world. And there are very big problems. If you look at renewables as you've spoken about them, I agree with everything you said. It looks phenomenally attractive. But when you get down to the practical questions, for example, we're paying energy companies not to put renewables into the grid when there's an excess because of the problems of distribution through the grid. So here in the UK, there really is a massive expense being carried by the consumer to accelerate this journey to zero carbon. We're heading for a really 2030 date, which to many of us seems not really practical. It's too early. I mean, does this sort of debate affect your city alliance? Or, I mean, I think in California, for example, you have many advantages because the sun shines a lot longer and there are, various other issues.
Absolutely. Look, the short term costs and the long term costs have to both be assessed. So there is a long term cost of living cheaply in the short term. And I do think politicians need to figure out a way to help the average person get through that transition. Need to directly subsidize bills that can bring down and not shock a family barely surviving. But that family will pay more, and their kids and their children will pay more, not just in health costs, but ultimately in energy costs, if this transition isn't made. Jobs will be left on the table. They won't even have jobs to go to. There won't be the sort of manufacturing and energy and other related jobs, auto manufacturing, et cetera, if we don't make those transitions. But you're right. In California, there was a lot of talk like this about 10, 15 years ago. We can't afford this. And now, when I was at the UN for New York Climate Week a couple weeks ago, a great line was said by somebody. There's not a single country that has looked back and went too fast. When you look at the winners right now, it's everybody who went faster. And that future is there to be claimed. So absolutely, you can make a short-term cost analysis and say, this is hurting people today. And then you have to answer 10 and 20 years ago why my country has no jobs, why the health concerns are there, and why we lost that future when we could have won it. And so to me, it's more of a micro issue of figuring out within budgets how to help people during this transition. And we're seeing time and time again that this energy is cheaper. It is cheaper than the legacy fossil fuels. Here in Los Angeles, We have the largest urban oil field in the world. A quarter of the world's oil in the 1920s came from Los Angeles, of the world's oil. To cap single wells here sometimes costs $1, $5, $10 million for a single well, and we've got hundreds of them. So that has to be paid by taxpayers also. Might not be on your power bill, but it's going to be somehow in the taxes you pay. And so the quicker we can figure out a way to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, the dependency is there. Look at China. There's been great articles this week about the high voltage power system that China is putting everywhere. And it's going to be the first kind of electricity driven economy. I don't think China is dumb. I think China is very strategic and smart about that future. And we can continue living in the past, but we shouldn't let those short-term costs keep us from the long-term low-cost benefits.